I'll make mine really brief, I think, so that we have the interaction. Just a couple of points. I think the point about the imperatives of the new constitution, and it's not too new anymore because we're almost 2 years down into the referendum that brought it into place, is important to emphasize. Because when you review the steps towards implementation, then as a Kenyan who was very excited about its promise, one starts to get worried. So I think we have to remind ourselves and very loudly talk about the things and the promise within that constitution. Equity is center stage. So I think it's important to emphasize that this is an imperative. It's not a thing about we could choose to do it or we don't. I mean, the constitution demands that we think about equity in a very serious way. We're talking about accountable governance. I think that places the idea that we involve people, that participation is meaningful, and that decisions that are taken on behalf of people are taken in a way that reflects their will. So I think that's also important to emphasize. The whole idea of citizenship, as a Kenyan, for the first time, when the referendum happened, was a feeling that there is some meaning to it. That when I say I'm a Kenyan, it's not just about holding an identity card or being within the borders of this country, but that there are certain entitlements that are very core. So the Bill of Rights is very expansive, and that's deliberately so. I think after years and years of struggle, Kenyans were very specific about what they want as entitlements for citizens. So the right to education, to health, to housing, to a dignified life as human beings for all Kenyans. Those are explicit in the Constitution. The equal rights of women, so the belonging, the fact that Kenyan women are just as equal citizens as the other gender. So if we recall all of that, so it's a very bold, it's a very broad set of things that are very tangible. If we trace the steps in terms of doing the things that we now need to do to make sure that it becomes reality. I mean, that was a journey that we all knew would be a difficult one, but we were also very hopeful that it was possible. So I think that we have to emphasize again that the thinking and the ways in which we act have to be different. So some heterodox way of looking at things, not business as usual. I think many times we feel now that there's a very casual approach to trying to deal with these very fundamental things. So we have to have a serious rethink, I would say. If we look at the aspect of economic policy planning, so even issues around how we get our economy to grow and all of that, I don't think that we can continue with the trajectory that we have been on, because we've seen how far that can take us. When we do the debates around ensuring equity in this country, I like somebody else said, it's not an abstract conversation. This is a country of multiple contrasts and realities. When on the one hand, many of us worry about traffic on our way to work in our cars. For many other Kenyans, the reality is one of waking up wee hours of the morning, 5 o'clock, and trekking and trying to go and look for work and not being sure that you will find it, and coming back to a family that is expecting food on the table, children who need to go to school, or sick family members who can't afford medical care. But that's the reality of the Kenyan nation, that there, alongside a lot of opulence and wealth, also sits extremely unacceptable and inhumane levels of deprivation. And that's the decision that we made as a people when we passed the new constitution, that that is not acceptable. We can do better. So we have to have a candid and very honest discussion about the very bold actions that have to happen if we are to redress this unacceptable reality of inequality in Kenya. So we have to talk about land inequities and very boldly say that the way things stand is not acceptable. So we have to spotlight, and I know that in a very quiet way, as is happening with a lot of the constitutional commissions now and some of the appointments, we will soon hear about the land commission being in place. And the problem with these opaque and quiet ways of instituting constitutional commissions that are supposed to be the watchdogs on behalf of citizens, but also to uphold the key tenets of the constitution, is that we then start to lose it from there, and then we're not sure that the aspiration that's in the constitution will be realized. So we have to spotlight land inequities. When we talk, we hear about the grievances, the historical grievances. So for instance, groups in the coast. And it's not just the coast. I mean, there are many, many parts of this country where feelings of marginalization and exclusion are real. And people question in a very real way the meaning of their citizenship and why they're part of the Kenyan nation. So those things have to be put on the table and discussed. Unemployment levels are extremely high. Many Kenyans are well educated. but are not able to find meaningful ways to exercise their skills. And even when they opt to do work in the Juakali sector, the sort of support that you'd expect in terms of regulatory frameworks, but also tangible support, even in terms of enabling people who are very creative and innovative by themselves to sort of add value to the things that they produce, including even, for instance, procurement decisions. If you go to Eastlands, but also everywhere, the kind of articraft that is produced, if you're to think about government procurement, if, say, we were to make the choice that we're going to consume from some of our Juakali producers, the difference that it would make in terms of availing the market, but also perhaps creating support mechanisms to ensure that the things they produce have value addition. So it's a kind of innovative, creative thinking to respond to the unemployment challenge. So to question our consumption patterns and to really ask the question, every time we allow imports, that we're actually taking away jobs from Kenyans. And I think that it is time for many, many unemployed Kenyans, and many of us are young people. I am not young, but a lot of the unemployed people are young, but I'm in the unemployed or partially employed category, need to demand and start to really question some of these patterns. I mean, the opulence is on our face. The traffic jam oftentimes now is also about the very lavish lifestyles of public servants who, every time they're going to a place, then we have to all be reminded that, they're going somewhere. So, the very outrageous convoys and motorcades, this sort of thing, we need to question because these are our resources. These are our tax resources. So we need to actually engage from a point of view. I said the thing about the holistic meaning of citizenship means that actually we need to be staking a claim on public resources. Because on the one hand, when we are told that we fund most of our budget, I think there's a disconnect there where we don't actually link it and say it is the money that is taken and generated from tax revenue in a big way that is used in ways that do not really serve our needs. So I was outlining some of these unacceptable trends. So I mentioned unemployment levels, but also the quality of life for many Kenyans is not at a level that is in tandem with the expectations of Kenyans. I also just touched on a bit because I think that there was reference to the fact that perhaps the World Bank and others aren't really involved in conversations and the choices that Kenyans make. And I beg to just slightly differ. I think that whereas Kenya doesn't have the on-your-face experience of direct budget support, this kind of support, but the aspect of soft power is very real, and we all know about it. Now more than ever, including the fact of the current coalition government, that there was very direct and not so soft power that is being exercised within the scene of decision-making in Kenya. And in the area of economic policy, or even right now, the critical moment of transition when we're trying to discuss ways in which we chart a path that can allow us to implement some of the key aspects of the Constitution, we do know that there's a very real direct influence. Some of it is in terms of knowledge being generated and analytical work that is in a very real way influencing the sort of choices that we can make in closing off the possibility of having real and meaningful discussions and debates amongst Kenyans, because these are discussions that have to be had by Kenyans, citizens, Kenyan organizations, and then for choices to be made. So in a real way, I think that that's an aspect that we have to be very careful about, because in a very real way, things are slipping and their interests, many times not Kenyan ones, they find convergence with Kenyan interests that are also interested in the status quo to undermine the possibility of having a real meaningful transformation in this country. And I think one can go into tangible examples, but I think for me, the aspect of economic policy design, how we roll out devolution, is one area where I can point a finger to very direct, disempowering analytical work undermine what is possible. I'll just end on the point where I'm saying, if you think about what's happening globally, with the financial crisis and some of the effects of it, which is clearly a verdict on that it is not possible to continue doing a lot of economic thinking and practicing the ways that we have done. The orthodoxies that have been dominant have been proven to have failed. So yet in light of that, we're not seizing that space to actually force through alternatives that work differently. I think it's a challenge to us in Kenya because we have a real moment to actually redefine the ways in which we can deal with our challenges. Doing nothing is not an option, but if we do choose not to do anything that will transform our country, that will assure equity, then in a real way this country sits on a time bomb and we're very fragile. And this is not alarmist, empty rhetoric or statements. I think this is very real. Anyone who lives in this country and is conscious about their surroundings is aware that it is very fragile. And at stake is our own cohesiveness as a nation. So when people ask real questions about what it means to be part of this country and to get a raw deal, those are real fault lines. At stake is the possibility of building a strong Kenyan nation that is founded on very tangible things around belonging, inclusion, entitlement, respect of the dignity of human beings, and all of that. So we can no longer make assumptions about people being able to wait. We cannot wait for the economy to grow. The economy has to grow alongside real actions to ensure that it proceeds. The proceeds of growth are shared in a way that is equitable and fair and affirms the rights of everybody else. Trickle down doesn't work, and that's not up for debate anymore. So it's actually it's not acceptable to suggest that we shall wait for the cake to be grown. I know this is said all the time, that the people who raise the equity debate are the people who are saying constantly about share the cake and not worrying about making the cake. It's not an either-or question, but you can't always be ready to say the cake has to be baked first and then shared. We have to think about ways of baking the cake and also ways of sharing it in a way that doesn't keep everybody else hungry. I think I'll end there.